Thank you very much for the lovely introduction and the opportunity to speak with you this evening, for which I'm very grateful. And it is, of course, a particular delight for me to be interviewed by a former student. So I just want to acknowledge that. And
I was actually never your student. I just admired you from afar in 3 years of law school.
But you were part of the Asper Center. Is that
yes,
right, so?
peripherally, yes.
Okay. So, anyway, so I became involved in Omar Khadr's case in 2007 through a colleague in the United States who is an immigration law professor there. He had been representing Omar in a civil suit in the United States to try to obtain his release. And we met at a conference, and he asked me what was going on in Canada, why wasn't anybody doing anything to support Omar Khadr, defend his rights, and so on. And so I went into an explanation about what then was called the kind of Khadr effect. And if you may or may not recall that Omar Khadr's father, Ahmed Saeed Khadr, was active for many years in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and at one point was detained by Pakistani authorities and sought the assistance of the then Canadian government under Prime Minister Chrétien to secure his release, which Chrétien did. And a few years later, Ahmed Saeed Khadr was then found to be connected to Al-Qaeda, and this is post 9/11. And suffice to say that the Prime Minister felt betrayed, as it were, and he wasn't going to lift a finger to help anybody in the Khadr family after that. And that was the so-called Khadr effect. So I went through all of that explanation, and he looked at me and said, "Oh yeah, I know all about that, but why isn't anybody doing anything?" And so at that point I thought, well, he has a point. And what happened after that was that he, a couple of other legal academics involved in his case, and perhaps most importantly, a man named Lieutenant Commander William Keebler, who has since passed away, who was appointed as Omar Khadr's military defense counsel, came up to Toronto. We organized an event at the law school, did some, they talked about his case, and then we met afterwards to talk about what could be done as a matter of advocacy. And from that moment, I was involved working primarily with Bill Keebler. I was never working with or for, except sort of tangentially, his Canadian counsel of the time, Dennis Edney and Nate Whitling. I did, however, become involved with Human Rights Watch and went down as an observer to the Guantanamo Bay military commissions on 2 occasions, in 2009 and 2010. By the end of 2009, Lieutenant Commander Keebler was no longer on the case, but I remained somewhat engaged with the subsequent Military Defense Council. And the work I was doing with them was primarily directed at political advocacy, mainly, with some legal advocacy as well, to try to urge the Canadian government to seek Omar's repatriation to Canada. After that, during that time, I also represented Human Rights Watch as an intervener in 2 cases that went to the Supreme Court of Canada in relation to Omar Khadr, in which he won both cases. So that kind of lays out most of my involvement in his case, and I think it's just worth knowing sort of what my role was with respect to that. I also worked with he had Canadian counsel for a while who were not Dennis Edney and Nate Whitling, somebody named John Norris and Brodie Bethel, and I also worked closely with them. So that's my little background.
Okay, so now we'll get to the meat of it. I'm going to put to Professor Macklin many of the claims and arguments about the settlement that have been circulating in Canadian media and international media, especially the most vociferous ones have been against the settlement, and then Professor Macklin will analyze them from a legal perspective. It's not often that I get to play the role of a Jason Kenney or an Aaron O'Toole or a Peter Kent, and I don't relish it, but we'll see how it goes. So first, an argument that, or a claim that we've heard frequently being made about the Khadr case is that Omar Khadr killed a medic in violation of the laws of war, and so he's a war criminal.
Okay. So the short answer to this is that the soldier who died, Sergeant Spear, was training to be a medic. He was not acting as a medic during this battle. I cannot state clearly enough that this is an undisputed fact. And that is to say that the United States never alleged that Sergeant Spear was acting as a medic at the time of his death. And if anybody was going to make that claim, it would have been the prosecution. They never claimed that because he was not acting as a medic at the time that he was on the battlefield and killed. Now, you might say, what difference does that make? So now what I'm going to do is take you on a little walk through the international law of war. So, stay tuned. Here we go. When a lawful combatant kills another lawful combatant on the battlefield, it is not murder. So this is an exception to our normal laws that when a person kills a person, it's murder, deliberately, right? That does not happen on the battlefield between lawful combatants. That's called combatant immunity, right? There are exceptions to combatant immunity. One exception, I'll give you a couple of examples. One exception happens through what's called perfidy. If somebody disguises themselves as a civilian, but in fact is a combatant and kills somebody, that's a war crime. Okay? When somebody pretends to surrender and then kills the other combatant, that's a war crime. It is also a war crime to kill somebody who is a medic. Okay? So, in other words, there is no combatant immunity in those cases. Okay? That's why this claim that Sergeant Spear is a medic matters, and that's why it's important to understand that it is false. And that the people who have made this claim most recently are people in the position to know it's false, namely members of the former government. And I think it's particularly confusing and disconcerting to imagine that people would be deliberately spreading this falsehood when they are, of course, in a position to know. But I can't do otherwise than to say it is false. The U.S. government knows it, doesn't even rely on that. And because the U.S. government could not rely on the killing of a medic as proving the commission of a war crime, okay, the United States created a new crime that would ostensibly include Omar Khadr. Everything I'm going to say now assumes something that in fact is open to challenge, but I'll return to that later, which is, did Omar Khadr in fact throw the grenade that killed Sergeant Spear and wounded another person? Let's assume for the moment that he did, but there's reason to doubt that, but I'll return to that later. As I said, he's a combatant, kills another combatant. Ordinarily, that's not murder. And of course, as a consequence, you also can't sue for damages from that death. But if you are not a lawful combatant, then what? So one might argue that Omar Khadr was not a lawful combatant under international humanitarian law, the laws of war. And why is that? Well, has to do with not being a member of an organized regular army, not wearing, a uniform that signifies it, and so on and so forth. So there are arguments that can be made, right, that he was not a lawful combatant. He was certainly a combatant, but not a lawful one. Right? So far, so good. But the consequence in international humanitarian law of being not a lawful combatant and killing somebody is that you lose combatant immunity. And what does it mean when you lose combatant immunity? You can get charged with murder. Not a war crime, just murder. The kind of murder that people are charged with every day in Canada and the United States, elsewhere. The deliberate killing of another human being. If you are charged with that kind of murder, however, ordinary civilian murder, right, then you are treated as a criminal accused. And you are entitled to all the procedural and evidentiary rules and all the protections that go along with being accused of a crime. Okay? So far where I've taken you to is, okay, was it a war crime because he killed a medic? No. Okay, but was he an unlawful combatant? Maybe. If he was an unlawful combatant, what happens? Well, then he should be charged with murder. Was he charged with ordinary murder and treated as an accused murderer? No. What happened next? The United States created a new war crime. And they called that war crime, it changed names over the years, but it was basically murder by an enemy, alien, unprivileged combatant. And there are various, and I get the order wrong sometimes and the words have changed, but you get the general idea. Alien as in not a citizen. So in other words, if you're John Walker Lind, you're a US citizen, you can't be charged with it. Okay? Unlawful, meaning you don't meet the definition of wearing a regular uniform and fighting for a state and the sorts of things that are associated with being an ordinary lawful combatant. Alien, unlawful, unprivileged, version of the same, unlawful. So, murder by an alien, unlawful enemy combatant, or some variation thereof, becomes a new war crime. This is not a war crime that exists under international law. It only exists under the United States Uniform Military Code for the military commissions. This law, this crime, was invented after Omar Khadr was captured and applied retroactively to his actions on this battlefield in Afghanistan. Okay. What's wrong with that? Okay. Well, here are a couple of things that make it problematic. Okay. One problem is that according to the rule of law, and I'm using that as a basket term to encompass general principles of legality, how you run a system called a legal system, how you make sense of a legal system that holds together, has some coherence, meets basic principles of not being arbitrary, of being general and knowable, and law that can be followed. One problem for the rule of law, in terms of creating laws that are knowable and can be followed, is retroactive criminal laws. How can you obey a law that didn't exist at the time you committed the act for which you're now going to be criminally punished? Right? So one problem with this is retroactivity. Okay. A second problem with it is a lack of what I might call formal equality, meaning treating likes alike. Because what this law does, okay, is say this: it is lawful for a US soldier to kill Omar Khadr. Right? US soldiers are lawful combatants and they can kill. They have the benefit of combatant immunity. If Omar Khadr kills a US soldier, it's a war crime. So if you can see here the asymmetry. US soldier kills, lawful. Omar Khadr kills, war crime. Okay? That kind of asymmetry is also problematic. Now, there are various arguments and counter-arguments about that, but I won't get into it. I hope that you can just see that that's a problem for a principle of legality. Okay? So, I took you from, he was a medic, down to, I hope I've explained why. First, he wasn't a medic. Secondly, this is an invented war crime. Third, it's being applied retroactively. Fourth, it has this quality of asymmetry. Okay? And I haven't even gotten to the part of, oh, and by the way, he was 15 years old. But we can maybe talk about that part later.
But Omar Khadr confessed to murder in the military commissions, and since you have to come to the court with clean hands, he didn't deserve any compensation from Canada.
Right, so we can take two things, two ways of taking that apart. One is the confess, and two is the clean hands. Okay, so starting with the confession. I don't know whether Omar Khadr threw that grenade or not. I'm not sure that Omar Khadr knows whether he threw that grenade or not. I also think there is considerable evidence that he didn't throw the grenade, but I don't know the answer to this, and so I'm not going to rely on this. But suffice to say that in the time I spent involved in this case, a couple of things emerged. One was the possibility that the shrapnel that killed Sergeant Spear was partly friendly fire. This was not fully pursued for various reasons, so I'm not telling you this as if, I've got a conspiracy theory and here's the answer to it. I'm just telling you that there was evidence out there that could have been explored on that point. Something else that was known, and this is not disputed, is that Omar Khadr, contrary to what was often portrayed, was not the only man who survived that firefight. There was one more, and he was summarily executed by U.S. soldiers on the battlefield. Okay? And it is possible that he was the one who threw the grenade. You may know that Omar Khadr was basically buried under rubble. And he had a hole the size of a grapefruit in his chest. He had shrapnel in his eye and remains effectively blinded in one eye. And yet what he confessed to was having been shot and then looking at his watch, seeing that it was 3:15, pulling out the pin of grenade and throwing it. That's what he confessed to, among other things. He also confessed to meeting Maher Arar in Afghanistan or Pakistan, where it later emerged, of course, Maher Arar never was. Right? He confessed to a lot of things. What is not disputed is that Omar Khadr, Omar Khadr was tortured. And there really is, I think, no doubt that Omar Khadr was tortured. And I attended the Military Commission hearing into where this was a preliminary motion about the exclusion of evidence, namely excluding his confession. Why? Because it was obtained by torture. Omar Khadr swore an affidavit where he listed the various kinds of torture that he was subject to. So, just to remind you of what that is, hours after he was released, he was taken from the battlefield to a field hospital in Bagram Air Base. He was operated on, and much is made of the fact that his life was saved by U.S. Doctors, and it was, and I think I don't want to take away from that. But when you think about why they saved his life, know that within 3 hours of surgery for the injuries I just described, he was being interrogated by a man named Joshua Klaus. And Joshua Klaus was the subject of a documentary film called Taxi to the Dark Side that depicted, among other things, two taxi drivers who kind of wrong place, wrong time, stumbled into Bagram Air Base, were then detained and tortured by Joshua Klaus to death. So Joshua Klaus was interrogator number one. That was how he was known. He was accused of torturing people to death, cut a plea deal with the court-martial system, wherein he received a kind of he pled guilty to a reduced offense, and was then discharged from the military. So this is the person who was the chief interrogator of Omar Khadr for several weeks, starting within hours of surgery. And he did things like shine bright lights into Omar's eyes, which had been just blinded, was operated on. Threw him off the gurney, sort of sick dogs on him. Held him in stress positions for several hours. And there's a famous story of him being urinated on and dragged around. That was actually in Guantanamo Bay, not Bagram. Most of the interrogation happened in Bagram. Threatened him with rape by 3 big black men in an American prison. This was Joshua Klaus, who testified by video conference from an undisclosed location in the United States when I was in Guantanamo. Why am I telling you all this? Well, just to remind you what this meant to say this man, was tortured. When questioned about it, and the questioning was very constrained because of the procedural dimensions of this military commission process, but suffice to say that when asked very specifically about specific things that he was alleged to have done to Omar, he either said no, or in the case of the threatening with rape, he kind of smirked and admitted that one, or he said, I don't recall. So it's really important to think about what it means to say I don't recall if I systematically tortured somebody every day for several weeks. Well, I can't remember that. Right? You know, if I asked you if you jumped off a bridge in 1994 at 5 o'clock, you might have trouble remembering what you were doing in that. Some of you might not have even been born, but whatever. You might have trouble remembering what you were doing in 1994 on this day at that time. But I bet you would be able to say with absolute 100% certainty, no, I did not jump off that bridge. Because you've never jumped off a bridge in your life, right? Most of you. So if a guy says, can't recall if I hung him in a stress position, I can't recall if I subjected him to sleep deprivation for several hours at a time, right? What is that telling you about what this person's métier is? So with all of that, that's how Omar Khadr's confession came about. In our law, in the law of every country that claims to abide by the rule of law, and even by those that don't, right? Confessions extracted through torture don't count. Okay? So to return to where I started, I don't know whether Omar Khadr did or didn't throw a grenade that killed Sergeant Speer. But I do know that his confession doesn't prove that he did. Okay? So that's really the bottom line. There are other things that Omar Khadr did. Okay? He was videotaped participating in the assembly of improvised explosive devices, IEDs. There was a videotape, shows him, I think it's, there you have it. Okay? He was charged with an offense related to that as well. Okay? And I think, you know, just for the sake of full understanding, yes, there was evidence of that. So, but, you know, not bad. And there you have it. But with respect to the offense of murder, okay, it's the confession, and I'm telling you that that confession is unreliable. There are other reasons why, just as a matter of principle, you don't torture people, full stop. But among those is what I'd call the kind of consequential reason, which is, and by the way, the confessions you get from people under torture are not reliable.
But even if the U.S. may have violated Khadr's rights, Canada's violations of his rights weren't that severe. They may have interrogated him knowing he had been subject to sleep deprivation, but is sleep deprivation even really torture? After all, new mothers experience sleep deprivation. That's an argument that was made on Twitter.
Right. Do I really have to answer that? Yes, sleep deprivation is torture. And, you know, in the same way that, I don't know, there's a lot of debate now about solitary confinement. You might choose to go live as a monk and voluntarily seclude yourself. That doesn't mean that solitary confinement is okay, right? I mean, you know, that you can confine someone. You may live as a monk for 5 years. That doesn't mean that solitary confinement for 5 years is not a violation of human rights. Right? But anyway, I won't belabor that point. So what is Canada's responsibility here? And let me start. I think some people contrast this to the situation of Maher Arar, who we collectively have decided is an innocent man. And that somehow that matters for why he has to be compensated. Or why he had to be compensated. But if you sort of think about it, and you take seriously the idea that everyone is protected by human rights, it's not a popularity contest. And you don't know, and you may not know in advance of when somebody is tortured whether they're guilty or innocent of anything, right? So you can't possibly say it's okay to torture the guilty, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Stop there for a moment. Let me just turn to what's Canada's role. Okay. So every other government of every other Western nation whose citizens were detained in Guantanamo Bay, and also even in some cases permanent residents, asked for the repatriation of their nationals from Guantanamo Bay. Why did they do that? Did they do it because they thought these people are really nice and we know them to be innocent of anything that might be alleged against them? Well, no, they did it because they were their citizens, and part of the job of a state is to respect the rights of their citizens and to protect their citizens. That's part of the big trade-off, right? That we all, I'm not a big fan of the social contract, but here you go. We all join into civil society and give up our rights to self-help, to vigilantism, right? We exchange our own personal entitlement to use violence in our own defense in favor of the state doing it, because we're all going to be better off that way. But in exchange, the state has to be protecting us, right, from violence from others. Now, as I said, it's not that I'm a big social contract person, but if you get the idea that part of the job of the state on a variety of theories is to protect its citizens. If you believe that, then you will notice that Canada, unlike every other government that had the capacity to protect its citizens, not only did not take any steps to protect its citizen, did nothing, but actively participated and was complicit in the human rights violations to which he was being subject. It is true, and I think it's important to acknowledge, that there's a limited amount a state can do to protect its citizens when it is in the custody of another state. Right? We have authority to govern, if you will, our nationals, and we have authority to govern people on our territory. There are lots of people on our territory who aren't nationals, but we have authority, the state has authority to govern them. Why? Because they're on our territory. And the state governs on this territory. I'm giving you the conventional view. Lots of ways of contesting that, but I'm giving you I think, what is the conventional understanding. So when I am on another country's territory, I am subject to their governance. Right? That's legitimate. Another state can exercise authority over me. Why? Because I'm on their territory. Okay? But a state can also assert some entitlement to try to govern me and indeed assist me because I'm a national. That's an alternative basis of what we call jurisdiction. And so the point here is, it is doubtless the case that Canada was not going to go in and invade Guantanamo Bay and yank Omar Khadr out of there. There's a limited amount that states can do when they're in the custody of another government. But they can do some things. Okay? And you can't necessarily blame a government if it gives it a good faith effort to no avail, and that does happen. But here, in a sense, what makes it not such a hard case is that the government made zero effort, and in fact, to the contrary, was actively participating in taking advantage of Omar Khadr's vulnerability, his persecution, his human rights violations to pile on and do more. So what does that do? That creates Canadian liability. Of course, primary responsibility lies with the United States. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But if you're asking what's the role of Canada in this, it is both failing to act when it could have acted and acting in ways that also violated his rights. That's the basis of the civil liability that at least Omar Khadr was suing in respect of. One more little point about that. So there were two cases that went to the Supreme Court of Canada. I'll just speak about the last one, the second one. That was a case where, for various reasons, what Omar was seeking there was to compel the government to ask for his repatriation. In that litigation, it was not a civil suit. Omar Khadr was not seeking damages. Okay? That's not what that case was about. The case was about getting him back to Canada. Okay? What the Supreme Court of Canada held in that judgment was that Canada had violated Omar Khadr's constitutional rights by doing one of the things I described, going down to Guantanamo Bay and interrogating him knowing that he had been subject to abuse, in a sense being willfully blind to what the full extent of it might have been, right? I don't want to know what happened to you, and now I'm going to interrogate you, right? And then handing over the fruits of that interrogation to the United States. So in that case, the Supreme Court of Canada already found that his constitutional rights had been violated. There were other sources of violation that were being pursued in the civil litigation. But again, you've already got the highest court in the country saying, look, the government violated his rights. So in thinking ahead to why settle, bear in mind that the government was already dealing with a finding by the highest court in the country that his charter rights had been violated. Okay. And did I answer that question? I can't remember. I talked for a long time.
Yes. But now Omar Khadr has been repatriated. He should just feel lucky that he gets to live in this country. The courts didn't order any monetary damages, so shouldn't the government have fought the case instead of settling?
Right. So, first, there is I think in the question or the way the argument is pitched, there is a confusion between remedying an ongoing violation and compensating for the harm that violation has caused. So if I'm beating the crap out of somebody, okay, and somebody comes and pulls me off or says stop. So I'm beating up somebody and someone says stop that right now, and I stop. We've remedied the ongoing violation. This person is no longer being beaten up. Does that mean that person cannot seek compensation for the broken bones that I caused while beating them up? No. Right? There's a difference between remedying the violation, stopping an ongoing violation, halting it, bringing it to an end, and seeking compensation for the damage or the harm that was caused in the course of that ongoing violation. Right? So to say, you should just be grateful that I stopped beating you up is not really an answer to the nature, the intensity, the extent of the damage or harm that was wrongfully caused through the ongoing violation. And so that's why he should just be grateful that he's been repatriated is not an answer to the ongoing, to the harms or damages caused in the course of that violation.
Even if we agree that Omar Khadr should have had some monetary compensation, though, isn't $10.5 million too much compared to what other victims of violations have received?
Right. And here, I have to say, I am not a litigation lawyer. I don't have expertise in how you quantify damages. So I lay that out in all honesty. The law is always in the business of monetizing the unquantifiable. Right? How do you attach a value to a human life? How do you attach a value to being able to walk? How do you attach a value to losing your childhood? We don't know I don't know how that gets monetized. And for those who think 10.5 million was the wrong amount for that, I guess they have greater expertise than I do in how one comes up with those numbers. Some people think that Maher Arar got 10.5 million and he was innocent, therefore Omar Khadr should not be getting 10.5 million because somehow he is not genuinely innocent in some meaningful way. And I am not sure what people, again, rights, human rights are not just for those we think of as good people or people who we think of as unblemished or people who we think, that's not how it works, right? So prisoners can be mistreated. Prisoners in jail who've been convicted of crimes and are serving the time can nevertheless be mistreated and potentially sue, right? It's not about having clean hands, right? You can do wrong to people who are bad people. Okay? I'm not saying that's Omar. I'm saying it's a non sequitur to think that because you may not think he was a good person, you may think he was fighting for Al-Qaeda, and I'm not going to argue about any of those things, right? Just to say that is not responsive to the complaint that his fundamental human rights were violated by a government that has a responsibility to protect him. And when people talk about his lack of innocence, again, I'm just going to, by the way, he was 15 years old, but also you don't forfeit your human rights, right? It doesn't kind of work like that. And so I guess this argument about clean hands is as I say, kind of a non sequitur. If you think that he was not a lawful combatant, he could have and should have been charged with murder. Okay? I'm not saying he could not have been charged with murder. If he had been charged with murder, there are a whole cascading things that should have happened in terms of the kinds of rights and protections and entitlements that he had. I'm not making so if you think he's coming without clean hands, he should have been charged with murder, but he wasn't, right? That's not his fault, right? So you don't get to say, well, I think he might have been convicted of murder, or as one of the many people who chose to correspond with me in recent days suggested that he could have, should have been charged and convicted of treason. Well, coulda, shoulda, whatever. That's all kind of besides the point. Right? You can't assume that what would have happened had he been charged with that, and it doesn't diminish the damage done to him because of the path that the United States and Canada chose to pursue with respect to him.
Finally, it is simply atrocious that Omar Khadr is now a millionaire, while the real victim of this whole saga, the widow of the soldier who was killed, Tabitha Speer, has nothing.
So the death of Sergeant Speer, I think, is surely a tragedy to his family and to his country. Soldiers die on the battlefield with some frequency. I don't mean to trivialize that. That's what war does, right? People die on the battlefield. If every time a Canadian soldier killed somebody else on the battlefield and the widow of that other person sued the Canadian soldier for monetary damages, that would be a bit odd, right? To acknowledge the tragedy of that person's death. That's not how the law, we don't think of that, right? We don't imagine that every Canadian soldier who kills somebody ought to be able to be sued by the family of the deceased soldier, as tragic as it is. It is really an extension of the same principle of combatant immunity, right? If he was a lawful combatant, then the death of a soldier is a tragic loss for his country and his family. It's not a crime. Similarly, it's not an actionable, civil, it's not a basis for civil liability either. The only way that you can understand Tabitha Speer having what's called a cause of action against Omar Khadr is if you accept that he was rightly convicted of this offense of war crime, of murder of an alien unprivileged enemy combatant. If you buy that, then you might buy the civil suit. But if you don't buy that, then there is no basis in law for her lawsuit, as far as I can tell. So if we're concerned, as we could be, about families of soldiers who die on the battlefield being properly supported, that's something that the countries ought to provide for all families of all soldiers who die on the battlefield, right? Similarly, if we are concerned, as I think people have articulated, that our own veterans get inadequate support for the injuries that they have suffered on the battlefield, then by all means, our government should be doing more for them as well. I don't want to sound too partisan, but I think some of the most significant decline in support for injured, including psychologically injured veterans of the Canadian Forces was under the previous Conservative government. So it's a bit rich to complain about Omar Khadr getting a settlement as if it is taking money out of the pockets of veterans. Those are, again, not connected, and I would discourage an attempt to link them in the way that I think some have.
I'm done playing devil's advocate for now, so we'll take questions from the floor. There's a microphone on that side of the room, so please make your way to it if you have a question or a comment for Professor Macklin.
Given the situation that was evolving, can you help me understand why the American soldiers didn't kill Omar Khadr?
So I don't know the answer to that. As I said, there seems to be undisputed evidence that they did execute the other surviving member. But remember, one reason why you want to save the lives of enemy soldiers, one reason may be compliance with the international law of war. So don't let me diminish that, and don't let me suggest that people aren't acting for that reason. You also want to interrogate them. You also want to get what Sergeant Klaus referred to as actionable intel. And indeed, Omar Khadr was the source of actionable intel, because it was under torture that he revealed the location of this, or I can't remember how, it was basically in the course of his interrogation that they found, wasn't a result of what he said, but they did find this video cassette of the building of the IEDs. So there's a reason. And I don't mean to sound overly cynical, but... Oh, I apparently am not keeping the microphone closely enough. Anyway, but was my answer clear enough? Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. I want to ask you to comment on a question that isn't really explored in all of the discussion and vitriol around the Omar Khadr case. And I'm a lawyer, but I don't purport to know the answer to this question. I'm interested in your thoughts on it. There seems to be an unspoken assumption, even on the part of some of the people who've defended the settlement, that the presence of those combat forces, those American combat forces in Afghanistan at that moment in time was lawful. My vague recollection of what transpired in the months leading up to the invasion of Afghanistan was that the Bush administration immediately, or almost immediately, accused Osama bin Laden, who it believed correctly apparently to be in Afghanistan, of having organized, masterminded the attack and the 9/11 attack, and demanded that he be handed over to the American government. I also recall that the Taliban then said, well, show us the proof and we'll consider your request. And my recollection is that the Bush administration declined to provide the proof. Perhaps it had the proof, perhaps it didn't, but it didn't provide it. That's what I recall. If in fact those facts are correct, or whether or not they're correct, do you think as a matter of international law, the presence of those combat troops in Afghanistan was lawful?
So I have also heard arguments on both sides of that. And to put it in the most colloquial way, the United States invaded. There were, all sorts of fights, on the ground. What did you expect people to do, kind of thing? Is it surprising that you would have these sort of battles? The effect of the American, the laws I've described was to make it, in effect, illegal to do anything but surrender or die. But because I am not, and let me concede, I am not primarily a scholar of international humanitarian law, I have heard those arguments, but I have not taken a position myself on that. It is the case that, history is written by, if not the victors, then those who are more powerful. And there really wasn't a lot of space available to advance that argument. It wasn't an argument. So when I attended military commissions, I got to know that the military defense lawyers, like the late Commander Keebler, were constantly playing this game of arguing from inside and arguing from the outside about the legality of what was happening. And when I say the inside, it's like, okay, I will play by your rules and argue how even according to your rules, what you're doing to Omar is unlawful. And sometimes I'll step outside and say this whole system is corrupt. This whole military commissions process is a violation of the rule of law. What they couldn't do was step out even further and say, and this whole invasion of Iraq, unlawful. Right? They didn't have the space to do that. It was not going to get them anywhere. Nor would any court listen to that. Mm-hmm. Nor is there an international body that would be, hearing that kind of argument. And so it remained very much in the realm of academic argument. Right. So that's not much of an answer. That's just more of a kind of answer about why that argument was not made more forcefully.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there was a standard definition of what a lawful combatant is. The attack in Afghanistan was done without a declaration of war, and does that impact on whether the U.S. forces were lawful combatants in that case? And as a point of information on another segue here, like some feedback, I looked at the poll that was used by the major media to claim that most Canadians were against the settlement. And when you break down the poll, the The questions included how well do you understand the case? And only about 20% of the respondents answered that they understood the case well, and the other 80% understood the case between somewhat and not at all. So there seems to be a bit of cherry picking in the Canadian media as to what they want to derive out of this poll, and they're using it for political purposes, and this poll coincided exactly with Andrew Scheer's comments that the settlement was, quote, disgusting, and there seems to be some sort of coordination, in my view, of media, pollsters, and political parties setting up the Conservatives and Andrew Scheer as being the next so-called tough on crime and tough on terror, and using the Omar Khadr settlement as a launching pad for this. And I think this is actually borderline racism, because had Omar Khadr been Christian or perhaps Jewish, I don't think that the Conservatives would have taken this approach.
So the first part of your question goes really back to the legality of the war itself, and I don't have a lot that I can add to my confession of my limited understanding to the last person who asked a question about that. The definition of lawful combatant, as I recall it, doesn't necessarily turn on whether the conflict itself is recognized at international law as an interstate conflict. It has more to do with regular army attire that signals you are a member of some kind of force, the force being connected to a state. Those are the sorts of indicia that I know to be the case. On the matter of
Sorry, Audrey, may I just ask you? My understanding of the international laws of war is that it separates the requirements for getting into a war legally from the requirements of conducting a war legally, so that it doesn't matter which side is in the right and which side is in the wrong. Everyone has equal rights and entitlements in the international law of war, which is actually to the benefit of people to preserve, right? Right.
I mean, the goal is to humanize how people engage in armed conflict. And so although there are definitions of, that apply to the instigation of the war itself, the regulation of the conduct in the conflict doesn't depend on that determination. Because you want to sweep as many people as you can into this regulatory system, right? So that they feel bound by it. But on the matter of the poll, in a sense, it wasn't. It's not a question about which I have any greater insight than anyone else in this room does. Do I think borderline race? I don't think it's borderline. I think it's right over the border myself. But I will say this about what people know. It is remarkable how strongly an opinion can be held at the same time as one confesses not understanding the factual legal predicates upon which that opinion would ostensibly be based. But I think it's really significant here to know that first, this did not start with a conservative government. This started with a liberal government. There are no heroes in this story, right? But the conservative government, certainly over 9 years, engaged in a relentless campaign of vilification. And they marshaled their considerable resources in communicating with the public to reinforce that vilification at every opportunity, without exception, without nuance, without qualification. And I think it would be naive to think that that doesn't work over time, and that it hasn't had a deep and abiding effect that is difficult to dislodge. So I think propaganda can work, right? And the fact that people sustain an opinion in the face of admitting that they don't know the facts is a kind of testament to that. It's also reinforced, I believe, by those those men who were former politicians charged, who were in government, Kenney, Harper, these guys who were formerly in government, repeating lies now, right? Saying again that Omar Khadr killed a medic. Because these are people who we know and believe have access to the facts. We may not know all the facts, we can never know all the facts, but surely the Prime Minister wouldn't lie.
No, of course not.
No, but so it's disorienting to hear them say over and over again he killed a medic in the face of contradictory evidence. And when that happens, and when it comes from people who you may agree or disagree with, but that's not the point here, who are saying things that are untrue, like flat out not true, it has the effect, I think, that we talk about with Trump, that it destabilizes interest in truth as such. Then people just kind of become indifferent to what is correct, what is true, and what is not. And then it just becomes, oh, well, you can never know anything for sure, and it doesn't really matter, and you say this, but they say that, and who can ever really know? Right? And once you've traveled to that place, then you're really lost. Right? Then I'm lost, because all I have to use, all that is in my toolkit is, here's the evidence, here are the facts, here's the law. But if you say you don't really care, then I'm actually kind of stuck. And I think that's what having formerly powerful people repeat things that are untrue, as if to say they are actually indifferent to the facts, has an effect that is calculable on the general public, who will then express a very strong opinion while admitting they don't really know what the facts are, and not caring to know what the facts are.
Thank you. My question is about the judicial system. By many, he is regarded as a convicted terrorist. There has been judgment granted against him for 340 million or whatever the amount is. Now, those judges, quote unquote, made those decisions based on some law. Hearing you, it seems to be a very clear-cut case. So they must have either not understood the law or they made political decision. If that's the case, that obviously explains the question that was asked earlier, the intensity and vilification purely on political basis, not on judicial basis. And from there, my question also is, I'm asking this question as co-chair of Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, what is the role of Jews and Muslims in Canada to raise their voices to sort of educate the public opinion? Because now it is a matter of polls. The 75% that you said consider this as a wrong decision can certainly be influenced if we join forces and do something to influence that public opinion. Thank you.
So he was never convicted by a legitimate court. He pled guilty, and that's the basis of the conviction. Oh, he was not convicted by any legitimate court of law. He pled guilty. Okay? So, and that was part of the plea deal that would enable him to be repatriated to Canada. I attended the military commissions twice. I can tell you that it had all of the form of a legal system. After all, the United States legal system is probably the most sophisticated, arcane legal system in the world. It knows how to put on a good show. And one of the distressing things about being there as a legal academic was being amongst lots of media who were enchanted by the display of what looked like a trial. But in fact, if you dug down into it, it was vacuous. It was form without substance on a variety of levels. I gave you one example, which was this ersatz war crime. But I could give you other examples about about the procedures, about the way, the rules of evidence and so on, but I won't I'll ask you to take my word for it. But the problem there was the enchantment effect, that it looked like a trial. Now, as I said, it came to an end with this plea bargain, so there was no conviction. Going forward, at least some of what has happened at Guantanamo Bay has been subject to appeal before real courts, stateside in the United States. And in fact, some of those, some of what has happened at Guantanamo Bay has been set aside. So that's just a way of responding to, what about the fact of this conviction? Well, there's lots to be critiqued about the basis of the conviction. In terms of what a Council of Muslims and Jews or anybody else can do. So let me reiterate, I'm at a bit of a loss when facts, evidence, and law have no persuasive effect on people. I understand, and so what you really need are people who have expertise in rhetoric and public relations and sort of, that sort of thing, which I don't have expertise in. I have read, but again, many of you may be more informed about this than I do, that in fact, when it comes to trying to shift people's entrenched opinions, they don't, going at them with the facts. The evidence law not only often fails, but oddly enough, they leave more committed to their prior views than they were before. Maybe they've become defensive about them and actually hew to them even more strongly. So it's like, oh man, I'm really sunk here. What has apparently some effect is hearing from people that they already identify with ideologically, personally, or for other reasons. People from within. So, and I think that the most powerful examples of these, or some of the most powerful examples of these have come from the area of sexual orientation. Right? When people who have been very homophobic or whatever, have been vocal about it and persuasive and have exercised a leadership role in that, they come to a different view. They will be amongst the most effective advocates to those whose views have not shifted. So if we're talking about Muslims and Jews or anybody else, that's or a kind of left-right split or a political party split. There is a little factoid that I have picked up. So people like me were kind of useless, as far as I can tell.
Well, I have to say I'm completely persuaded by your facts and evidence, but maybe it's because I already identified with you as someone who's interested in truth. We have many more questions and not that much more time, so if it's okay with you, Professor Macklin, maybe we'll take 3 questions at a time.
Why don't we just take all of the questions at once, and then I will write them down and I'll answer them all at once.
So anyone who has a question, please just line up behind the mic so we can get an idea of how many we have coming.
Okay.
Okay. No one else in the room has a question?
Okay. How many questions are left? 5?
No, everybody just ask your question,
yeah.
and then I'll answer them all together.
Everyone can ask your questions, but it's just so we see how many there are. Just if everyone who has a question will go to the mic.
I'm vertically challenged here.
We completely empathize with that here.
Thank you. I was born in 1942. In the 40s and 50s, I seem to remember something or other about, are you now or have you ever been a communist? Does anybody else remember that? Coming up through the airwaves? I feel like we've gone back in time. I mean, this is ridiculous. The amount of racism that's going on in this country is incredible. It's just exactly the same feeling that's coming up from the gut that was coming up then. Everybody wanted to go after communists. I'm sorry, now everybody wants to go after Muslims. In the 40s and the 30s, everybody was going after the Jews. When are we going to grow up? When are we going to begin to realize that we can't keep doing this to each other? These lies that are going on about Khadr, we know they're lies. The so-called medic, by the way, I've Googled all the information I need. I know what the hell's going on. I'm sorry, I shouldn't swear. But I am so angry about what's going on. I've Googled all the information. People don't need information. They've got internet. They can find out everything they want. They have to choose whether they're going to go to the real stuff or whether they're going to go to, I've forgotten the name of that group, right-wing Bart, something or other.
Breitbart.
Yeah, Breitbart, whether they're going to get the information from him. People pick and choose. Somehow or other, we have to start reminding them of history and what we've gone through in the past, and that we're doing it again. The so-called medic, that the wife is trying to get money for him, according to my research, he was wearing indigenous clothing and he was armed. My question is, were all the soldiers, the American soldiers in quotes, were they all in indigenous clothing? Because if they were, how would you know that you were dealing with American soldiers? For all you know, you were dealing with another group of rebels. So there's an awful lot of questions out there. I'm sorry, I know we were supposed to ask questions, but I needed to get up and say this. Thank you.
Actually, I was in line.
I know, but we talked about it.
And I let a woman go first,
Go ahead.
and now I go.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think that was an interesting point. In response, could we just have some silence, please? Thank you. On the point about rhetoric, I mean, I'm not a rhetorician, but I did study with an old French rhetorical genius, and I think rhetoric gets a bad rep. I think when we talk about the enchantment effect, I don't think that that's adequate rhetoric that's being used in the media by our politicians in North America. I think that the basis of rhetoric as an ancient art does involve certain principles of coherence, consistency, context, the study of logic. So that's really a rational exercise, and I would say that it is a question of politics and law, as one of the former speakers or question makers did bring up, and the question I wanted to raise was related to what you said about retroactivity and the rule of law, because I do think it's at the heart of the question today. What has changed? What has changed in Canadian policy to reconsider cases where law doesn't quite protect or even acknowledge the existence of even one human?
Next question, Dorothy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both very much for your comments and questions. My question is about child soldiers. Isn't there international legislation about child soldiers? And hasn't Romeo Dallaire written extensively about this? And I was given to understand that this was something that we all know that he was 15 years old, but in many books that would be child soldier. So I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
And just to add to that, 74% of Canadians acknowledged he was a child soldier and should have been treated as one. So if you could also talk a bit about the discrepancy between people who acknowledged he was a child soldier versus still opposing the settlement. Next question.
I'm just going to answer them all at once. Everyone ask. I'm writing them down.
I have two questions. What are the requirements and the legal actions in order for the Canadian government to take against another country to advocate for its citizens' rights? This is number one. Number two, is it legally allowed for a Canadian citizen to file a lawsuit to the Canadian court against another country?
Sorry. Okay, my question more or less is directed at you rather than the scope that we've got, though it involves that. We've had comments from our ex-Prime Minister saying he's sorry for Canadians that this award has been given to Omar Khadr. We've had statements that have been made by our so-called political pundits that they oppose what's happened. What we haven't heard, and we really have not heard, is anything from human rights organizations in the paper actually explaining the stand that we've all heard today here. There's a lot of argument that has been made today, a lot of facts that have been put out today, but none of this, absolutely none of this, has been brought forward by the human rights organizations through the communication channels where the general Canadian public would be better equipped to look at what was happening. Why were they silent? That's all I need to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was very distressing, both in the instance of Omar Khadr, but what was most distressing of all was basically your admission that your toolkit is empty. And if this toolkit of facts, evidence, and law is what we're counting on, is the only thing that we have, and it's the only thing that we're hoping for that will make changes, but is null and void effectively. So it's, you know, that's pretty despairing and distressing to you and to all of us. But my question is, did that toolkit actually ever exist?
I would like to say thank you and congratulations for presenting something that I think was very technical and complicated and totally plain English that even I could understand. I think you did a fabulous job. I have a different soft question. If you can't answer it or don't care to, pretend I never ask it, if that's okay. I'm consumed with thinking about where we all, but especially Omar, go from here. There feels to me, from what I have seen, a huge disconnect between the person that he presents and what this man has gone through. And living in a country, I don't care 10 million or 5 billion, living in a country where 75% of people are so against him and so not understand how he got to here. Where do you think he'll be going with this? Do you think he's the kind of person that he appears to be on media, or how could he not have been affected by the terrible things that have been done to him, whoever did it and for whatever reason? If you can help with that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to all of you for your questions. Now I'm going to take them sequentially. I won't answer all of them because some of them were comments about which I don't necessarily have anything to contribute. How did the people in the compound know that they were being attacked by U.S. soldiers in this firefight? Well, again, I don't know if I can answer this, but it was a firefight and there were bombs from planes overhead, which would have signaled that this was the United States, right? They were the only ones who had the planes. Rhetoric. I wasn't using rhetoric pejoratively, so I take the point that I actually think this is a challenge for how to communicate in a way that reaches people. And there are lots of different ways to do it. I use the one that I am trained in and know best, but I am keenly aware of its limitations. So that's perhaps all I can say about that. Child soldiers. Glad somebody asked, because I realized I didn't devote any attention to this. And here's a bit of an irony. There is no legal category in international law of the child soldier. That is to say, there is no international convention on child soldiers. There are lots of instruments in the international legal domain. Lots of people talk about it and write about it, and there's lots going on. So it's not as if this is non-existent. But there is no treaty that has created this new legal subject called the child soldier. It is a phenomenon that is happening. It is a way for people to talk about the human rights of minors who are engaged in combat situations. And so we are bringing together what is kind of what's conventional, positive, written up, international law about the law of conflict, the law relating to children, and human rights law. So we have a Convention on the Rights of Children. We have the Geneva Conventions about the laws of war. Okay? And we have a number of international human rights instruments, like the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, among other things. And child soldiers are this kind of phenomenon out there in the world that then these different sources of international law are being marshaled together to talk about. To say that Omar Khadr should have been regarded as a child soldier is really a way of saying his human rights as a 15-year-old should have been respected. The Convention on the Rights of the Child speaks to the particular concerns, the rights of children as children. That includes things like subject to different standards because they are not as fully mature. That includes things like the special duties of a state to protect those who are minors. So there are a variety of things about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In terms of conflict, it's about when and how and to what extent are minors who are engaged in armed conflict responsible for their actions. It is, and I don't want to press too hard on this, but it is an irony that we show a lot of concern and compassion for child soldiers who have done horrible things while child soldiers, unspeakably horrible things. Right? And I am not suggesting that they do not deserve compassion and rehabilitation and all of those things. But they have, by their own admission, and if you have ever listened to any of the young men who have talked about being former child soldiers, they have done horrible things by their own description of it. Omar Khadr may or may not have thrown a grenade, and he was filmed putting together IEDs. But because the person who died was an American soldier and not, for example, an African child or African, whatever it is, there's no good way of talking about this. There's no good way of talking about it that doesn't seem to validate some kind of hierarchy of human life and value, so I'm not going to get into it. I think you just get my point here. But there's very little that I need to say, in a sense, about child soldiers as such to get across the concerns about him being 15 years old, having human rights, and and the application of international humanitarian law. So it's a curiosity that people imagine the child soldier to be this legal category that somehow means something different than saying he shouldn't have had his human rights violated. Because if you buy that, he shouldn't have been tortured, he shouldn't have been detained for all these years, he shouldn't have been treated like this, then the only next step you have to make is, if those things were done to him, and one of the consequences of having those things done to you is that those who are responsible ought to be responsible for compensating you for it. Right? And if you can buy that Canada was responsible through its action and inaction, then you have made the links that make it kind of contradictory to say he should have been treated as a child soldier, and yet he doesn't deserve any compensation, right? If you just draw the links between what it means to say, presumably he's entitled to have his human rights respected, then you would, I think, arrive at the point of saying maybe he deserves compensation. Okay, what can states do? So I'm not sure I wrote this question down correctly, but two things that states can do: exercise what's called consular assistance, which is a kind of informal mechanisms of communicating with other governments and communicating with somebody who is your national who's being detained by another government to provide them with assistance. In an ordinary situation, right, let's say a Canadian is being charged with a criminal offense in another country. It doesn't mean that the Canadian government can have that person sprung from jail. Right? What Canada can do is say, you're going to be tried with an offense, you're entitled to be treated fairly. Right? That's the kind of protection that might apply in a given situation. Okay? Diplomatic protection is a little more formal. It's where the Canadian government can actually formally kind of engage another government in and say, look, you are not living up to your obligations with respect to our national. We are asserting our ability, our capacity to protect this person. That can actually be taken all the way up into the International Court of Justice, for example. Suing another country. So that's a really complicated area of law about which I'll just say that there are limitations on the ability to sue another country in a Canadian court, and that relates to an area of law called state immunity. Okay, states are often immune from civil suit in respect of things they do as states. I'm not going to pursue that all here. Not heard from human rights organizations in response to Omar Khadr. I think they have been vocal. And the arguments that I've made tonight, I have made in several different places in the media. Print, radio, TV. I don't know. I guess I think Amnesty has spoken out about this. So I think there has been. One of the things to know is that neither I nor human rights organizations nor anybody else has unqualified, unconditional access to media. Right? Like, they're not waiting. Generally speaking, that's not how it works. So sometimes it's hard just to get attention. And so there is something to take into account about that.
But just for those of you who are interested in reading about the case, if you want a refresher for tonight, Professor Macklin's op-ed in the Globe and Mail that was issued after the Khadr settlement was announced is excellent and really breaks down the legal issues clearly. So that's one example of a human rights perspective in mainstream media that you can read. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Did the toolkit ever exist? I don't know. I just don't know what to say. I think there are times and places and circumstances where I think people are more and less open to persuasion. And I can only repeat that the relentless campaign of vilification shut down a lot of potential conversation, debate, and so on. But I don't know. I mean, I have no good answer to that question. Where to go from here? Where will Omar go from here? How is he affected? Here I want to pay particular tribute to Lieutenant Commander Keebler, the late Lieutenant Commander Keebler, because it was really through his extraordinary efforts, really extraordinary efforts, that he obtained for Omar psychiatric and psychological aid while he was in Guantanamo Bay. And it is only, I believe, thanks to that intervention, which was, and of course the professionals who provided that, who were in there also extraordinary. Okay. I think it is thanks to them that Omar is doing as well as he is, but of course, that is not to take away at all from Omar Khadr's genuine work to put his life together. I think that also says something to us about, and all this talk about, veterans and all of that and how they should be getting more support for PTSD and all that. I could not agree more. And if Omar Khadr's ability to thrive today is in part thanks to that intervention, then the lesson you ought to take for that is we ought to have more of that intervention for Canadian veterans as well, by all means, right? The answer is not take it away from him or diminish him. It's, wow, if somebody could go through what he went through and still put himself and his life back together, then that's a tribute to the importance of that kind of intervention for anybody who is affected by conflict.
The lawyers his lawyers, Canadian lawyers with whom he's living, also deserve some credit in this regard.
I think, in fact, Dennis Edney is through his efforts that he got a teacher who came down to Guantanamo Bay, who's really, really remarkable instructor. She teaches at King's College, actually a Christian college in Edmonton. And she, her name has now slipped my mind. Last name starts with Z. Arlette Zink. Unbelievable. Right? She absolutely devoted herself to tutoring Omar. And again, like Lieutenant Commander Keebler, an unsung hero. In addition to that, lots of people know Dennis Edney's name because Dennis Edney was very much in the media. But the person who did all the legal work of that team was Nate Whitling. Not somebody who sought any media attention, but all the legal work. that was done by that team was done virtually all of it by him, and he deserves an awful lot of credit for that.
Can we take one more?
How many people here would want to live Omar Khadr's life starting next weekend, even if they knew they would get $10,000 a year? I wouldn't. The whole thing is unconscionable.
Okay, now the really final comment from Barb. Well, you did spoil the surprise ending because we were going to do an exit poll. But maybe we can say, did anyone change their mind about the case on the basis of this? Do people want to say which way?
I'm not sure about that. It is true that one of the Guantanamo prosecutors, who was prosecuting, I think he was either a supervising prosecutor, didn't have a specific case, or dealing with another case, subsequently became quite a critic of the Guantanamo process. His name's flown out of my head. But I don't know of anybody on the on Omar's prosecution. There's also somebody who was one of the interrogators who also kind of repudiated his role as an interrogator and spoke quite openly about what he did and what others did. That's all I know. But I can't control, none of us can control what Jason Kenney sends out, right? And of course, I mean, and I'm picking on Jason Kenney, but it could be anybody, right?
He's a pretty good target, but there are several.
But people are not accountable for what they're putting out there. And they have a lot of capital with certain audiences. And I don't know how to get at that. I just don't.
I'm going to close it up. I think we'll have to end there. I think your comment is really Is it really quick? Yes, in the Wall Street Journal.
Can I very quickly? There was
John, with you, it's never quick, so it actually really has to be quick.
It's very short. I believe there was one other person alive in the compound that came out just afterwards. It got squashed very quickly. So if there's two people alive, how can you guarantee one person committed the crime?
Yes?
Yeah, he was executed on the battlefield.
I think a lot of the comments that we've heard are really a testament to how excellent you are at explaining in plain and clear language legal concepts which are very complicated, which is why we all loved you in law school and which is why we were so delighted to have you. Word travels. But it's why we were also so delighted to have you here with us tonight. So thank you again, Professor Macklin, so much for an extremely cogent and comprehensive analysis of what's been represented as a very contentious case in mainstream media. So thank you. For those of you who are interested in demystification of things that are demonized, we're having a screening of the film Real Bad Arabs, which was based on a book by the recently deceased Professor Jack Shaheen, who was an expert in the racial stereotyping of Muslims and Arabs, particularly in Hollywood. So this film is based on his analysis of over 1,000 Hollywood films, and it looks at the ways in which Arabs and Muslims are represented in stereotypical ways. And then we'll follow that with the discussion on contemporary representations of Muslims and Arabs in media, from Argo to movies like The Big Sick, which purport to portray Muslims in a more humanizing light. So for that, that's on July 28th in the evening. Admission is $5, and we hope to see you all there, inshallah. And thank you again, Professor Macklin. Oh. Well, I know you're fired up about this case.
No, with this Jason Kenny couldn't imitate you. You were more Kenny than Kenny.
I take that as an utmost insult.
meant to be.
So thank you.
No, yes, you were. Honestly, these are the kind of questions that needs to be asked. And you did. So, give me the camera, and I want to take a picture of the city. Is that okay with you?
Oh, yes.
Cut me out on, I'm not.
Oh, I thought you wanted me to take a picture of you.
These are all good questions, and
Thank you. Oh, thank you. It was so good to see you. Hey, I saw you come in.
Yeah, that's right. I want to say hi. Not too bad. How are you? Yeah. Yeah.
And congratulations on
Tahoe?
Yeah.
The leave tonight?
Oh.
Is that what you're talking about? I don't know.
No, well, Lee was doing it.
That's right, yeah.
I just saw about Tahoe, refusing Tahoe.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I've been working on that aspect of the case, but Sinamai is at odds that I know. He's been very active in trying to bring the power of security regulation to bear on Tahoe. And the interesting thing about that is because in the legislature,